All right, so we will start recording. We're on, what is the date today? The 21st of February, and we are in Unit 4, finishing off the first half of the course in all aspects, today's fitting methods. Actually, today's fitting methods. And last week, what we covered, and Renee was wondering as well, we looked at the fitting formula called NALRP, which was more for pronounced hearing losses. And NALRP is kind of like a bridge between NALR and NAL1. Okay. And it's kind of like a tail end. It's right when compression hearing aids were beginning. And I was, an interesting thing about that particular formula, and I'm going to go to my PowerPoint, my things here. I'm going to pull it up here so you can see it. So I'll just pull it up here, and I'm pulling up this PowerPoint, and we'll go and move on down, down, keep going. Oh, I guess it's not even in there. Huh. Okay, not to worry. Maybe it's in today's. So fitting methods today. It'll go down to, oh yeah, here it is. Perfect. Here. NALRP. And it was an interesting finding. Look at the two hearing losses here. On average, the white hearing loss and the yellow hearing loss. They're both severe, okay? Only the white one has better hearing in the lows and worse hearing in the highs, whereas the yellow had worse hearing in the lows and better hearing in the highs. And the researchers in Australia found out that the people who had this hearing loss, like the white, they wanted more low-frequency gain and less highs, because here they had a cochlear dead area. And the people in yellow preferred less low-frequency gain, and they had enough hair cells to be able to use the high frequencies. And that's why now started to get into cahoots with the cochlear dead spot concept. And that's why now one targets ended in thin air, as we will see, okay? We also looked a little bit, if I go home here, we started talking about the game changer in fitting methods. And this is slide number 1 in our PowerPoint for Unit 4. And DSL, Desired Sensation Level, out of good old Canada by Richard Seewald at Western University in Ontario. This was the person who changed fitting methods and changed real ear. Instead of looking at insertion gain, R-E-U-R, R-E-A-R, the difference between real ear insertion gain, he said, no way, Jose. Let's do an SPLogram. Let's do speech mapping. And he took a real dim view of the old way of doing real ear, and we're going to look at the old real ear next week. We'll look more at that. But in case we'll take a look at it and say, he really wanted to, he didn't look so much at outer ear canal resonance, putting a tube in your ear. Here, I'll stop sharing for a second. I'll just show you. Put a tube in the guy's ear, have sound from the speaker, measure the outer ear canal resonance, then carefully hold that tube in place, put the hearing aid in the ear, turn it to the right volume, and measure the aided response. And then aided minus unaided was real ear insertion gain. And did that hit target? And Seewald said that is about the worst way that you can ever do real ear measurement. Because here's what it does. I'll show you a picture of it. Let's just look at this. I'll share screen, and I'll go to escape here, and we'll look at the other PowerPoint, and you'll see what I mean by this. We'll go to the end, all the way down here. Old real ear looked, here's what they did. They stuck a tube in the ear canal, okay? And you put a hearing aid on top of the tube and all that stuff, and you measured the outer ear canal resonance. So basically what you ended up getting, okay, here's how we do real ear today. And I don't have the slide here, but they just did real ear unaided, real ear aided. And he said, you know what, that's crazy. Because when you're doing a hearing test, you're plugging up the ear with a headphone. So if you're plugging up the ear with a headphone, you just drove a truck over the guy's outer ear canal resonance. So if you didn't use the outer ear canal resonance in your hearing test, why on earth are you using it for your hearing aid test? The only way you should use real ear unaided response is if you happen to test the hearing loss in a sound field with the ears unplugged, because only then you are using the outer ear canal resonance. But when you're plugging up the ear with an insert or a circumoral headphone, why? So he's the one that got into speech mapping, the way you do real ear today. And you can thank DSL for doing that, because that's exactly what it did. Now, last week, we got up to slide, where did it say? The last slide, then began Unit 4. Okay. Okay, so now let's look at today's, I'll share screen again, and we'll look at PowerPoint's or real ear today. And this is essentially what you're doing, isn't it? Okay, I'll make this larger. Here's normal hearing. And remember, this is all dB/SPL. It's all dB/SPL. So normal hearing is minimal audible pressure, MAP. What's the softest it took to hear all the different frequencies with one ear under a headphone? Okay, now remember, this is all dB/SPL. So, but really, this dotted line here is capital I, capital S, bold-faced, italics, underline, is 0 dBHL. Then the guy's thresholds are plotted up. Loudness tolerance levels are on the top. So now loudness is on the top, and the floor really is on the bottom. And then you're mapping speech, so that input average speech is amplified, so it's about 1/3 above the thresholds. Soft input speech is amplified, so it's a little above the thresholds. So this shows that the guy can barely hear soft speech. Well, why not? If I've got normal hearing, I can barely hear soft speech either. So what, tit for tat. And loud input speech is mapped so that it never exceeds loudness discomfort levels. Then, like an old stream or salmon, you can swim up the stream to die because you've mapped speech. And that's what they mean by speech mapping. But in the old days, when it was beginning, it was called the SPLogram, the SPLogram. So now I'll go to Unit 4, PowerPoint, Unit 4, the game changer. He took a dim view of gain, real ear unaided response, real ear insertion gain, because thresholds were obtained with headphones, and when you're testing headphones, you're plugging up the ear. So the targets that you saw on yesterday's real ear are based on thresholds that didn't even incorporate one's real ear unaided response in the first place. If you're going to use it, then your unaided threshold should have been obtained in a sound field, because this does indeed incorporate one's real ear unaided response. DSL totally changed real ear measurements. Gain, they said, is just a means to an end. Output rules. Output is the groceries delivered to the tympanic membrane. Remember, input and output are read in dB/SPL, not dB. Only gain is. Input plus gain is output. So the audiogram is changed to the SPLogram. We only care about real ear aided response. No more real ear aided minus real ear unaided. This A should be a U. It's actually easier than real ear aided minus real ear unaided. You're just using real ear aided response. So here's minimal audible pressure that I was talking about earlier, and this is added to your thresholds in dBHL to convert them into dB/SPL thresholds. And you remember from acoustics, minimal audible field is about 5 dB better than minimal audible pressure, because 2 ears are about 5 dB better than 1. And you got a little bump here. You have a little bump over here because there you have plugged up the ear with the headphone, and so you have driven the proverbial truck over top of the unaided ear canal resonance. That is my best French imitation of speaking English, that maudit anglais. All right, so minimal audible field. I hate it when that thing comes down on the top. Go away. Go away. Anyway, the softest it takes to just barely hear all the frequencies at 1 meter distance from a speaker with both ears. MAP is the same game, but with one ear under a headphone. And the little bump is caused by the loss of your unaided ear canal resonance because you've plugged it up with a headphone. So the hearing loss in an audiogram, you're adding MAP to that to get the thresholds in dBSPL. And that makes a much better counseling tool. See, that's also what Seewald didn't like about yesterday's Real Ear. You couldn't counsel much from it. Here, you can show a client, this is unaided speech, and you can only hear the low frequencies. And what we want to do is lift these up where they belong. Okay, you want to raise the consonants up and put them into the guy's dynamic range. So today's Real Ear, of course, makes a way better counseling tool. So probe tube measures today follow DSL's lead. And that's what we do. Okay, and if I can try and find a good old picture, I'll see once if this particular PowerPoint has a picture of yesterday's Real Ear. I'll just kind of see if it does. I'm not sure it does. I doubt it. It doesn't, but that's not the end of the world. It's okay. So basically, today's methods or probe tube measures follow DSL's lead. We are measuring outputs for soft, average, and loud inputs. Gain is yesterday's news. Gain is like me saying to you, did you drive a car to the store to get the bread? Did you walk to the store to get the bread? Did you take an airplane to the store? I don't really care. Did you get the bread? The bread is the output. Gain is just how did you get to the store? So gain is just a means to an end. Output rules. So gain was thrown into the trash basket. And let's remember from Zoom sessions a couple of weeks ago, what did the old fitting methods all look at? Half gain rule, the burger, the pogo, the now, Libby, all of them looked at gain. All of them. Okay? And that's not because they were wrong. It's because they didn't have Real Ear. And when you don't have Real Ear, you can't see what someone's hearing. So Liebarger, in the best thought, his heart on his sleeve, thought, you know what? We can aid by half the degree of the hearing loss. So if the hearing loss is 50, let's aid by 25. That way, I can believe, I can hope, I can't see it, I have no way of proving it, but I can hope that average speech will be placed nicely in his dynamic range. So if I take average input speech and add 25 to that instead of 50, I'm aiding average input speech. But mind you, I'm improving the thresholds only by half, but I'm doing that because he's not trying to hear 5 dB sounds. He's trying to hear 50 to 60 dB sounds. So yeah, you can amplify a 5 decibel input by the full degree of the loss. If I have a 50 dB loss, I can amplify 5 dB by 50, and now it's 55. Cool. That's not bad. But I can't add 60 dB by 50. I can't add 50 dB to a 60 dB input because now I'm at 110. You're going to blast them to kingdom come. So all the fitting methods followed the half gain rule, and they stuck on gain because that's the only thing they had. They hoped, H-O-P-E-D, hoped that when you amplify with half gain, the output will sit nicely in the listener's dynamic range, but they couldn't see that. Liebarger would have given his eye teeth. And that's why fitting methods, in a weird way, are kind of receding like islands in the setting sun. Because now we can see what someone hears. You know what I'm saying? It's like if you amplify so that soft speech is barely above thresholds, average speech, especially at 5, 1, 2, and 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those 4 frequencies are about 1/3 above threshold, and loud input speech, make sure it stays below uncomfortable loudness levels. You're doing essentially what DSL-5 is asking, what NAL-2 is asking, what NAL-1 is asking. I mean, you're splitting hairs because all those fitting methods are pretty darn close in what they are prescribing. And they're all doing essentially that. They're all essentially trying to accomplish, and I'll just show it to you here, they're essentially trying to accomplish this. All the fitting methods are trying to do this. And now we'll do this a little bit differently than DSL will do this. But essentially, if you are doing this, you can operate really without fitting methods. Because essentially, they're all kind of doing that. Okay? And that's why fitting methods, I say in a weird way, and I don't mean to be blasphemous, but in a weird way, they are becoming islands in the setting sun. Like faith is an island in the setting sun. Proof is the bottom line for everyone, says Paul Simon. Well, that's, now you got the proof. So I think it's really interesting to see I like looking at the history, because the history teaches us so much about where we are now and why. So with today's real ear, unaided speech can be laid across the unaided thresholds, and you can compare aided versus unaided speech. You get a nice little counseling tool. It's great. It's just great, laddie. So today's real ear, this is what they're all trying to accomplish now. So here's a tale of two compression-based fitting methods. DSL from good old Pinko Commie Canada, and now from the land down under, another Pinko country, British Commonwealth country, south of the border, or of the equator. And it's interesting that both of them are about the same size. Canada and Australia are almost exactly the same size, and they have about the same amount of people, almost nobody. I think Canada has 1/10 of the population of US. I think we got 35 million people. In a way, Canada's kind of like the country of Chile laying on its side. A skinny little band of people all living on the border. And Australia's got everybody just living on the edges. Nobody lives in the middle. It's just people on the edges. Anyway, and look at the logos of each method. It's DSL, serious, hearing loss going up. And then you've got loudness, discomfort level, and the need for compression and the high frequencies. And then you got, yeah, mate, want to go down to the corner for a beer? This guy kind of standing out there having fun. Well, here we go. DSL. Geez, I'm glad, Renee, you're here, because it's more fun to talk, at least when someone's here, than gabbing away to an empty computer screen. So thanks for showing. DSL. Its main focus was the audibility and comfort of speech. It originated in 1982 as a pediatric fitting method, and it began later on to focus on compression hearing aids. This is what they brought to the table, the SPLogram. Seewald was an audiologist working in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. He's an American, but he worked in Canada with kids. And he was using old real ear. Now, in order for me to really convey this to you, I am going to share, if I can, a picture of old real ear, just so you see it better, so you really get an idea of where I'm coming from. So hang on a second here. I'm going to scare up right over here, early real ear. Okay, pull this puppy up here and let it pull up. And I want you to see what it looks like. Okay, so here we go. Here you go. Here's the picture. Pull that puppy up here. Got it. Okay, here you go. Here's old real ear. Real ear, unaided response. Then they hold the tube in the ear, put the hearing aid in. Real ear, aided response. Aided minus unaided is real ear insertion gain. How close were you to the target? So the teacher or the parent or a caregiver of the child would say, what does that mean? And he'd say, well, that means the hearing aid fitting is done right. Well, how do you know? Well, I'm trying to make the black line meet the red line. It doesn't have any counseling. You can't explain anything with this. It doesn't, and that's what kind of upset Seewald, because this was not a very good counseling tool. And it's focusing on gain. And sure, all the fitting methods used, their targets were plotted in terms of gain. And it's no one's fault. It's just because real ear hadn't come into the picture. And when real ear first came into the picture, this is the way it was done. The fitting methods didn't change. Okay? Only thing that changed was the way in which it was measured. In other words, this is the way they used to do it functional gain. So these letter A's could pertain to half gain rule, the Berger method, the Nell method, maybe the A's would be in a different place, the Libby method, the A's would be in a different place, but this was the target that they used to use, right? Unaided thresholds under headphones, aided thresholds in a sound field. If you lift the thresholds up by half, you've done the half gain rule. If you lift the thresholds up by what Berger says, then you met his target, okay? And they did that so that aided speech output would sit nicely in the dynamic range of the listener, but they couldn't see this. They didn't have real ear. Then real ear came into the picture, but it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks. Okay, the methods didn't change one iota. It's just that now we used real ear. So the target here, this red line, this target is meant on purpose to imitate the letter A's. In fact, the numerical values of the letter A's are painted onto this red line to emphasize that the fitting method targets didn't change, just the method in which you verified changed. But this type of verification is stupid, and that's what Seewald said. And that's why he sought to plot everything in terms of SPL so that you can talk the same language with hearing loss and hearing aids. And you can focus on output and lift up the sounds so you can use a SPLogram as a counseling tool. Okay, there's that sermon. Now let's go back to Unit 4, and here we are, the SPLogram. So, aided speech. And here's long-term average speech spectrum. We talked about this too last week. And Renee, you will hear this when you watch last week's Zoom session as well. Here's unaided speech. And I went on at length as to why the mean is not in the center of the range. This range is about 30 decibels because speech varies by about 30 decibels as I'm talking. I'm not all talking exactly at the same loudness level. Speech fluctuates. So you've got a 30 dB range, but the average isn't sitting in the middle of the range. And the reason it's not is because unlike noise, here's noise, a fan or an air conditioner, it's steady in intensity over time. But the sound of my flapping gums is going, it's changing rapidly, staccato. It's the staccato-ness that makes the average not in the center of the range. Okay, so whenever you see LTAS, it means long-term average speech spectrum. You could call it unaided speech, but long-term average speech spectrum. Okay, cool. All right. And this slide here is just saying that the mean isn't in the center of the range. The mean is about 12 dB, below the top of the range and 18 dB above the bottom of the range, but basically, there you go. And here's another way of looking at the same thing. Here's the noise. Carrying on. If you took a statistical distribution of its intensity, it would have a bell curve. Most of the time, its intensity is at one level. Most of the time. Whereas speech, because it's fluctuating so much, it changes in its intensity distribution changes rapidly over time. In other words, the statistical distribution of intensity is weird. Just W-E-I-R-D, weird. Okay? And by the way, this is how digital hearing aids use digital noise reduction. They're trying to tell, is the sound coming into my mic, is it like this or is it like that? And if it's like this, it's going to have a statistical noise intensity or intensity distribution much like a bell curve. At most of the time, the intensity is going to be at one general level. But speech, you can't say that. So mathematically, the statistical distribution of intensity of speech is weird. And that's how digital noise reduction algorithms work. They're saying, is it like this or is it like this? And if it's like this, reduce the gain. And if it's like this, don't reduce the gain. Well, you had that in 240, so that's old hat, okay? So here's LTAS, long-term average speech spectrum. The mean is 12 dB above the top and 18 dB above the bottom. Anyway, I digress. The DSL goal was to keep this loudness relationship among the speech frequencies. This is how normal hearing people hear speech, and DSL preserves that. Now doesn't. Now has never done that. Now says, let's make, when we aid, let's make all adjacent speech frequencies contribute equally to the overall loudness of speech. So you can tell right away that DSL was going to provide a lot more low frequency gain because lows are normally heard louder. And if you're preserving this, yep, that's what you're going to do. DSL4 is how we began with compression. Okay, soft inputs like 50 dB SPL to imitate soft speech levels. Medium inputs of 70 and loud inputs were about 90. And the targets for average speech inputs were placed about halfway between the thresholds and UCLs. Now that is a far cry from this. Whoops, not that one. Here. Look at this target. Look at the yellow target here. It's only a third above the thresholds. DSL4 said, they plotted, they wanted the outputs for average speech inputs to be like where my cursor is, halfway between the O's and the asterisks. So DSL4 was a humdinger. It was a high-power hearing aid fitting method, and a lot of people didn't like it, especially adults. But DSL4 proponents loved it because it was aimed at children. And children need to hear all of speech in order to learn speech. So DSL began as a pediatric fitting method, and its targets were meant so that children would hear all the different sounds of speech and be able to acquire language properly. So, its heart was on its sleeve. It's just, but adults didn't like it that much. So here's a picture of what DSL4 used to do. Here's a normal hearing, MAP. Here's a noise-induced hearing loss going way up here. And look at the DSL4 targets. The plus signs are halfway in the dynamic range. Okay? And if you hit those targets with a hearing aid, probably the client would wind up and punch you in the head. Okay? Wouldn't like it. It might be a little much. Audio Scan out of good old Canada was the first system to use DSL. Actually, I laugh at this one. This is a great one, but it's almost like the old, I mean, it's just the ancient real ear, man. But you can still buy these on eBay. They're cool. The RM500, with whom DSL collaborated. Then came Now One out of Sydney, Australia. Originated in 1997, developed from Now R and Now RP. The main focus of all Now methods, including Now 1 and Now 2, is amplify unaided speech frequencies so they are equally loud. Don't preserve the natural loudness relationship of adjacent speech frequencies like DSL did. Recall, DSL's goal was to do this, preserve this. Now said, make all speech frequencies contribute equally to its overall loudness. So its philosophy was a little bit different. So Now tries to make all speech frequencies contribute equally to its overall loudness. And they said this would maximize speech intelligibility. So for normal hearing, lows of speech are heard the loudest. If we preserve the loudness relationship among speech frequencies, then you're going to amplify lows more than the other frequencies. And that's exactly what DSL did. And that's why Now 1 offered a lot less low frequency output than DSL-4. Remember this picture I showed you earlier? Forgot that it was in Unit 4. Good thing it is. Now RP, the predecessor, it's the bridge between Now R and Now 1. Okay? They made a distinction between audibility and effective audibility. These guys in white have so few hair cells here that you could make sound audible, but the person, it would not be effectively audible. The person wouldn't be able to extract any meaning from it because there's too few hair cells there. So ironically, contrary to what you'd think, the white hearing loss prefers more low frequency gain and less highs than the yellow does. So, and it's because of cochlear dead cell regions. So Now 1, compared to Now R, was fairly close, but it provided 3 targets because compression gives different gain at different inputs. So that's why fitting methods today, like DSL-5, Now 1, Now 2, they always offer 3 targets. One for soft inputs, one for average, and one for loud. And you're mapping the outputs to make sure they're plotted properly in the listener's remaining dynamic range. So how would Now 1 compare to Now R? On the left, you'll see a target for some fictitious hearing loss. It might be some mild to moderate sensory neural loss. When you look at Now 1 on the right, okay, you'll see 3 targets. And note also that the targets end in thin air. And the reason they end in thin air is because of this. Okay? They're saying the worst hearing, forget about it. Forget about it. Don't worry about that. They got so few hair cells there, forget about it. Okay? Amplify where you can. Hey, you can help the dying, but you can't help the dead. So basically, who cares about the worst areas of the hearing loss? But if you look at the middle target, it's almost identical to this one. Only this one goes all the way out. But this here at 1,000, this one's about 15. And at 1,000, this one's about at 15. And at 2,000, this one's at 20. At 2,000, this one's at 20. At 4,000 here, we're at 25. At 4,000 here, you're at 25. So it's not that the targets changed in 2 ways. One, you had more than one target. Secondly, the targets ended in thin air. But capital B, capital U, capital T, they're plotting things in terms of gain. See that? Now didn't want to enter DSL's world. Now stuck to gain. For the first few years, it said, no, we're not going to use that SPLogram. Well, for DSL, imitation is the finest form of flattery, because now they do. But they didn't. They came in dragging their heels. They did not want to use Seewald's plotting things in terms of SPL and output. So they stuck for a while to gain. Let's look a little bit more at Now 1 and what it did. So here you are. Here's DSL now. Here's Seewald. That's a picture of Richard Seewald, and he killed DSL-4. So he sent me this picture to say, okay, Ted, I killed DSL-4. Shot him. He did. Put him on ice. Okay? And he's a nice guy, Seewald. He's a good shit. Anyway, the death of DSL-4 in 2005. They went to a new version because of preferred listening levels. There was a study done in 2005 that looked at children, adult experienced wearers, and adult new users. And all of them preferred less than DSL-4 targets. So basically, DSL-5 is a lessened version of DSL-4. Basically, DSL5 and NAL1 met each other in the back alley, and DSL4 got the crap beaten out of it. So basically, it changed. Okay? NAL changed into NAL2 in 2008. They had new data on effective audibility that we talked about earlier. And they thought that the overall loudness was a bit too much with NAL1. And here's the thing to circle, right here. NAL2 gives less output in the mid frequencies. Less gain, less output in the mids. We will compare and look at how the fitting methods compare to each other. Don't think you have to memorize this stuff. Just forget about the middle one here. Just basically new data on effective audibility. They changed the fitting method to give less mid-frequency gain and more low and high. Let's look at how they compared. Here's a comparison. And look at this. They're still talking in insertion gain, but who cares? Now 1 is going to be the light lines, and now 2 is the dark lines. And you'll notice 3 targets for each. One's for soft, one's for average, one's for loud. Notice how the targets for now 1, here, here, and here, are all giving more mid-frequency gain. Whereas now 2, here, here, and here, generally is giving more low and more high. That's essentially how now 2 compares to now 1 for a sloping loss. Let's look for a flat loss. For a flat loss, now 1 is the green and now 2 is the black. Once again, now 1 is giving more in the mids and less in the lows and less in the highs. And it's kind of neat, you know, when you're looking at this, when you're looking at gain, okay, the top one is always for soft inputs, the middle one's for average, and the bottom one's for loud inputs. But when you're plotting things in terms of output, it's a different kettle of fish. Because when you're plotting things, whoops, not that one. Here, hang on. When you're plotting things in terms of output, the bottom line is soft inputs, the middle is average, and the top one is for loud inputs. So this is exactly the opposite arrangement when you're talking output versus when you're talking gain. Just FYI, remember that. It's a gain, you might see 3 targets, but the top target's for soft inputs. The bottom target's for loud inputs. With output, it's more common sense. With output, the bottom target's for soft inputs and the top target's for the loud inputs. It's just one of those twist things. Okay, so let's look at how they all compare. Let's compare the fitting methods and take this unit home, okay? For a flat loss. Now 1 versus DSL4, because that's what those were the 2 big contestants in the late 1990s, okay, early 2000s. These were the main 2 contestants for compression hearing aids. Remember, we're talking today's fitting methods, and today's fitting methods always offer 3 targets. Here I'm just showing you the targets for average inputs, okay? So for average inputs, let's look at the targets for now 1 versus DSL4. When you're looking at here, the plus signs are the targets for DSL4. I used to work at Unitron, and the real-ear system I used was the audio scan, so it did not have now 1 on it. It had half gain, Burger, Libby, Pogo, all of that stuff, and DSL4. So what I did was I programmed the hearing aid to match the targets for DSL4, and then plotted what it did. And then I programmed the hearing aid on Unitron software to hit now 1 targets, and then ran it again. And you could see less in the lows, less in the highs. Now there's 2 things that separate DSL4 from now 1. One is DSL4 provides more low frequency emphasis. Why? Because it's preserving the loudness relationships among adjacent speech frequencies, and the vowels are louder than the high frequency consonants. Heard that one 9,000 times, okay? How come DSL-4 provides more high-frequency amplification? Because now 1 had an affair with the cochlear dead spot concept. Remember, audibility and effective audibility. Don't aid the worst. Don't go searching after those high frequency thresholds that are way down there. Aid the transitions. You can help the dying more than you can help the dead. So why not? So basically now 1 gives less gain in the lows and less gain in the highs. Okay, essentially. And similar gain or output in the mids. All right, share screen. Well, this has been extra special. Okay, let's go now to a sloping loss. For a sloping loss, well, they're both given the same amplitude because there's no hearing loss in the lows. Duh! Okay, but where do they differ? Now 1, way less amplification in the highs. DSL-4, do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. All right. Don't worry so much about the child. Focus on the yellow and the white. DSL-5 for an adult, and now 1. Because for a child, DSL-5 is asking for more. But for an adult, flat loss. Now look at how this flat loss is changed to dBSPL, right? You're adding to this, you're adding this. And as soon as you add this to here, it's beep. And notice the decibel distance between 60 and 10 is the same as between 50 and 0. Okay, you're just plotting things in SPL. I digress. Okay, DSL-5, the yellow. Now 1, less in the lows, similar in the highs, more in the mids. And look at how DSL-5 is not even a third above. It's almost like a quarter above. It's really, backed off. That's for a flat loss. Look for a sloping loss. And again, don't worry about the orange. Sloping loss. Similar in the lows because there's no hearing loss here. Now 1, more in the mids. Now 1, less in the highs, and the targets end in thin air. DSL amplifies a little more. Now 1 versus now 2. How do they compare for the sloping loss? Now 1, more in the mids. And now 2, notice how its targets go all the way back out again. That's because audiologists had a small freak out. We want the targets. Yeah, well, we don't really care what you're going to do out of those high frequencies because they hear, we want the targets. They were freaking. So were the manufacturers because they had to make software. And audiologists had to use the software to fit the hearing aids. So the manufacturers begged now, please extend your targets out to 8K. Because if you leave them hanging in thin air, nobody's going to know what to do with the stuff. So reluctantly now 2 capitulated and extended its targets and made them stick out again. Okay? But essentially, that's one difference. And the other difference is now 2 provides less amplification in the mids and generally a little bit more in the lows and the highs. Good. And just painting broad strokes. That's the only way I know of it. How does DSL-5 compare to now 2? So these are the latest contenders. These are the 2 today's fitting methods. Sloping loss. How do they compare? Basically, DSL provides a little bit more. But look at this. Notice the targets go all the way out to 6K again. But look at how they compare. They're so darned close. Basically, DSL-5 provides a little bit more. And notice how these are even at the thresholds or even below. Now remember, LTAS has a bit of a width here. So there's still a little bit sticking up above the thresholds here. But the mean would have to hang here with DSL-5. And the mean would have to hang here with NAL-NL2. And notice how close the targets are. And keep this picture in your head. And while I move on, whoops, to a different section right here and look at this last picture in Unit 3. Here you go. So you're trying to hit the yellow. You're trying to hit the yellow. And you're trying to hit the yellow with, hang on. You're trying to hit the yellow with DSL 5 or NAL 2. What's the diff? You're so close. And then your client might say, it sounds a little bit tinny, and you're going to end up tweaking things anyway. So when you've got two fitting methods and the targets are like this, and you end up tweaking things on the hearing aid to suit client requests, you've already departed from the targets. So the targets really, in my mind, are just a general guide, because most clinicians end up deviating from the targets anyway. If it's a new user, you're going to deliberately fit below targets because the person's never worn hearing aids before. And then you might get somebody who wants a little bit more here or a little bit less there, and you're tweaking things. And right away, you've dissipated from the target. You've gone away from the targets. So what about that little tiny difference between NAL 1 or NAL 2 and DSL 5? It's really quite something. And if you're going to share screen here, what we'll talk about here, and I'm going to go to Unit 4 and see where we are. How far are we along in here? Oh yeah, we got lots of comparisons here to do. Okay, not really, not many. Here's how we're going to end today. When you look at this, you'll see an article where I was writing blasphemy. Are fitting methods islands in the setting sun? The author contends that a brief history of hearing aid fitting methods shows that they are converging back to where they began. In the beginning was functional gain. Real ear measures did not exist. All hearing aids were linear. I was trying to imitate the Bible there. And darkness was upon the face of the void, or whatever. Anyway, but I mean, it's just, if we look here, manufacturers' fits are a shot in the dark. And a lot of HISs and a lot of audiologists fit according to the manufacturer's software. And AudioScan put out this ad saying, well, that's kind of like doing this. All too often, we let the software do the walking and the talking, and we don't always verify with objective measures. Is the hearing aid doing what we think it's doing? Because the software will paint a pleasant picture. And look, here's the target for average inputs. And here's what the hearing aid is doing for average inputs. Verify that on real ear, and you might say, I don't think so. Okay, the software often paints with rose-colored glasses, okay? Usually the software paints a better picture. Output usually is shown to be what it really is with real ear, often less than what was predicted. Real ear allows you to objectively see the effects. You don't have to sit there relying on subjective verbal reports of sounds okay, too tinny. You can actually visualize the sources of complaints. But before we go anywhere there, what I want to do is look at our notes for Unit 4 and see where we are so that we can terminate today. I'm going to show you what you're going to see in the notes. Let's read them and just take a look from the top here. Fitting methods today. And it would be out of Chapter 6 in my weird little book. The first one was DSL 4. That's the first of today's fitting methods based on compression as opposed to linear. And then here we go. SPLogram, output is king. And a big thing about DSL4 was it was big time concerned with real ear to coupler difference, mic location effect. So one of Seewald's favorite sayings was garbage in is garbage out. If you build your house on the sand, when the storm comes, you're going to get washed away. If you're wearing a CIC, you're benefiting from the concha resonance because the mic is inside the ear. If you're wearing a RIC, the mic is up here. So you're not benefiting from the resonance of the concha. MLE, mic location effects. And when you're measuring hearing aids on a 2cc coupler, that may be one thing, but how does the real ear differ from a 2cc coupler? RECD, real ear to coupler difference. And the average RECD is about 5 dB below 1,000 hertz and about 10 dB above 1,000 hertz. And I'm wondering even if I might even have that particular slide. I might in the PowerPoints here. You never know. See if I got them. Don't get a seizure though. No, probably not. Okay, here, let's see if I got it. Where is that sucker? It always hides from me. Come here, you son of a gun, you sidewinder. Get over here. I'm looking. I'm looking. No, it's not in here either. Hang on. RECD, where are you, you stinker? There you go. Let's go to here. Okay. Move my way down. Move my way down. Move my way. Oh, that's real ear. Oh, yeah. Hang on. I'm looking. No, can't seem to find it. Anyway, I'll find it later. Stick to the notes. Real ear to coupler difference, mic location effect. Basically, what I can say about RECD is if you look at an ANSI spec and you're looking at the output on ANSI measurements, let's say you're looking at reference test gain or OSPL 90, if you add 5 dB below 1,000 hertz to the frequency response and add 10 dB above 1,000 hertz, you'll basically get at what the hearing aid's going to do in a real ear. Real ear to coupler difference. Okay, and move on away. Here's mic location effects. Today's fitting methods offer several targets because compression gain gives different gain for different inputs. So we covered all of that. So this is all in the PowerPoints. Okay, I asked people to put a star by this last week. Okay, many clinicians stereotype DSL as being hungry for high frequency gain and output. Not necessarily true. DSL-4 really asked for a mostly low frequency output because the vowels of speech are heard louder than the high frequency consonants. But DSL-4 also asked for more high frequency gain because DSL-4 tried to restore audibility of everything, and now was in cahoots with the dead spot concept, audibility and effective audibility. So the differences between NAL1 and DSL4 were seen for the low frequencies especially, and also to some degree for the highs. The mid frequencies were similar. Then we talked about NAL1, and we talked about how it evolved, and it too offered several targets. And we said, note that the target for 65 dB SPL inputs is almost identical for NAL-R and NAL-1. Okay, move on down the page. The main difference from DSL-4, DSL-4 tries to preserve average or normal relationships among adjacent speech frequencies, and NAL did not. Summary, there you go. NAL1 prescribes less low frequency gain than DSL-4 because it seeks to equalize rather than normalize the loudness of adjacent speech frequencies. And for precipitous high frequency hearing loss, as I'm reading here, NAL1 also prescribes less high frequency than DSL-4 because in these cochlear dying areas, not much effective autofriccability. Then you have DSL-5. There you go. There's that preferred listening level thing we talked about with the kids and the adult users, experienced and inexperienced. Don't worry about the numbers here. Couldn't care less. The point is DSL-4 overestimated preferred listening levels. Therefore, it backed off big time. Don't worry so much about the exact relationships for all of these things. Think with broad strokes here. Now you've got the new NAL2, And basically, the differences are mainly for the mid frequencies. You can read this kind of stuff here. It gets a little bit techy, I think. Basically, now 1 provides more mid-frequency gain and output and less low and high-frequency gain and output than now 2 does. Now 1 is always the one with a bit of a bump in the middle, and now 2 seems to do this. Now 1 is kind of here. Now 2 sort of flattens out. See how generally I think? Really. And the last part, manufacturer proprietary fitting methods are really bad. They roll off so many highs, it's unbelievable. We will look more at this toward the end of the course, at proprietary fitting methods from Phonak or from Bernafon or from Oticon. And it's best to stick to the prescription fitting methods, although the manufacturers don't like that. But when you're looking at proprietary fitting methods, they really roll off the highs. And we will show more of that toward the end of the course. Set that puppy on the stove and have a beer. So how you doing, Renee? Good stuff? Any questions? Do you have any questions from what I've talked about? Or
I'm sure I'll have more. I'll have some questions. I'll probably email you, but I'm
pretty good.
Or what you said before when you started talking about the half gain rule and
yeah.
all that in a couple of Zoom sessions back.
Yeah.
And it clicked with me at work.
Uh-huh.
I mean, really, like when it comes to programming and stuff, like you said, the manufacturers, they're set, like you said, it's just bad.
It is. It can be. They can really roll off the highs. That's one thing.
I see an audiogram and I see their loss, and then I see what they say, and I'm like, what? Why
would somebody pay $6,000 for a pair of hearing aids that's doing only that? You know, you got to wonder sometimes.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Well, I'll stop recording here and.